One of the things we talked about last week is that theology is always done for within a context, right? There's no, you can't just be objective and neutral. You bring your world, your past, your history, your location to everything that you do and think, and that's inevitable, and it's just the way it is. And one of the interesting things about history is that we're able to see, when we look back at the past, we're able to see this kind of prevailing instincts and ideas and thoughts that the people before us had, and we can see how their culture influences the way they think. Well, Christian theology is no different. So right now we're in a pretty interesting time in theology because I would say that, again, painting with pretty broad brushes here, theology was more or less kind of consistent in its what we call Hellenization, that is, its influence from the Western tradition and Greek philosophy, really for, the first, 1800, 1900 years of the church. I mean, it wasn't really until the 19th and 20th centuries that people started to kind of push back in really kind of protesting some of the really obvious influences of Hellenism on Christian theology and rethink other ways of going about it, as it were. Now, what does that mean practically on the ground, or at least in terms of what classical theism kind of taught? Well, in the time of the New Testament, the writers were saturated in a Hellenized culture, in a culture of Platonism or Neoplatonism. And as a result, that deeply colored the way that they would think about ultimate things. And one of the major kind of thoroughgoing aspects of Neoplatonism is Neoplatonism posits a huge gulf in between what they might call the world of the forms, or the world of the heavens, what Christians might think of as God's realm, the transcendent, and the earth and the here and the now. There's this massive gulf. In classical Platonism, this is called the problem of the forms, because in classical Platonism, Plato thought that everything that we experience here is a shadow of sorts of its perfect being in a transcendent in a transcendent beyond, right? So you'd call these things the forms, right? So if you look at a horse, what you're seeing, Plato thought, is you're seeing the shadow of the paradigm of horseness that's out there, that's beyond. It can never truly transfer, it can never truly translate to the here and the now. What we have here are just imperfect, grubby, bad horses that don't ever really come even close to what pure horseness is in the beyond. That's kind of a weird concept for us, but that's it at the very least it posits a very, very strong dualism, a barrier between what's ultimately real and what we're experiencing here and now. And that kind of prejudice is almost a pejorative word, and it's not fair to be pejorative, but it's a prejudice, just like we have our own. That prejudice colored the way that people thought about God. And one of the ways that it did is that the early Christian theology, when you get past the biblical period, when you get past the New Testament, you start to have, guys who are professional philosophers, like Augustine, for example, and Origen, when they're starting to try and make sense of who God is in light of the traditions of the church and in light of the scriptures, there's a really strong push to seize and to emphasize that dualism. Some examples. One of the classical Christian doctrines is the doctrine of immutability, the idea that God can't change. Okay? Immutability, well, I mean, maybe you believe it or maybe you don't. Maybe you grew up in a church and maybe you heard over and over, God, you never change, right? Well, that's an interesting idea, right? God never changes. What does that mean? I think most Christians nowadays would probably say something like, well, God's nature and character are solid, right? God is, a loving God, for example, and God will never not be a loving God. Okay, fair enough. But in the classical notion of immutability, and the classical notion of what it is for God to be unchanging, is a very distinct philosophical notion, okay? In the ancient world, they noticed that everything that changes tends towards decay, right? Entropy. Entropy was something that ancient people were keenly aware of. And so if you have a body, right? Again, if you have a body, every time that it's changing, it's heading towards death, right? And so change is a bad thing. Change takes something from a better state and moves it to a worse state, or conversely, there are examples. So you got your what? When do human beings peak? Like in terms of physical, like maybe 22. I don't know. So you have a 22-year-old, right? Every day after 22 years old is a day of going down. Right? That person's peaked. And now it's just a matter of survival until there's no more survival. Change is bad. Conversely, before you're 22, right? We'll just say that 22 is the age of human, I don't know, it's where you hit your moment. So you got little baby right here, right? Now little baby needs to change a lot to become this great 22-year-old. Well, what does that mean? That means that in order to get here, the baby, or this person, we'll call her Janelle. Janelle had to be in previous states that were worse than her ideal state at 22, right? So at any time from baby to 22, Janelle is imperfect. Change is bringing her towards perfection, right? Well, think about that then. If that's the case, then it means, if that's true, then that means that in every example of change, someone's either going from a less perfect state to a more perfect state, or they're going from a perfect state to a less perfect state, right? Well, that's the thinking that was underlying a kind of Greek Hellenistic notions of the perfect. And so change itself, the very idea of any change, became thought of as evil. Well, God's many things, but evil's not one of them. Okay, even if not evil, at least less than perfect, right? Perfect is this idealized form, this where everything is absolutely maximally excellent, right? That's perfection. That can't admit of change if change always implies going from a less good state to a more good state, or from a more good state to a less good state. If that's what change is, God has to be immutable. Now notice that that's different. Remember earlier we're like, wow, well, a lot of Christians today would say that, God doesn't change. That means that God's nature and character. No. In classical theism, the notion is that God does not change. God doesn't have emotions, right? For example, if God went from sad to happy, that would be a problem. Because presumably perfection on this view, what it is to be in an idealized state is to be in perfect joy at all times, right? An excess, an overflow of joy, infinite joy. There's no room for sadness there. Certainly God couldn't change God's mind, right? That would be impossible, because what that would mean is either God had a better plan before and it got worse, or God has had a weaker, not as good plan and it got better. Maybe. But if that's the case, then you have some pretty big problems if you're trying to make sense of the Bible. Jesus has emotions. God, in God's self, seems to change course. I mean, you get that famous text, I think was it Genesis 6, I think it's in the prelude to the Noah story, right? Where God looks at humanity and God regrets making human beings, right? I mean, you have two choices there, right? You can either say that that's just a euphemism so that God can be made more understandable to us. That's probably what a classical theist would say. Or you can say that somehow in God's perfection, it's possible to have a change of mind be a part of who God is. The major protest against classical theism in the 20th century really came about on the biblical side because a whole lot of biblical scholars were like, I don't know the God that the theologians are talking about, but it doesn't seem to be anyone like Yahweh. It doesn't seem to be a whole lot like Jesus, the Spirit, the Comforter. And from the theological side, people looking around being like, if God's like that, then why is our world like this? Why is there a Holocaust? Why did we just have World War I? Right? If God's perfection itself is a perfect set of perfections, if that's what God is, then God did a pretty poor job of creating. And that insight led a whole bunch of people to stop believing in God. I think it's worth sitting with that for a bit and to think about. Make a list in your head of all of the attributes of God that you know. For those of you with deep church backgrounds, you're going to come up with things like omnipresent, omnipotent, all-knowing, etc., etc., etc. And you'll notice that every single one of those things sounds a whole lot like the Platonic perfect form that has nothing to do with this reality, this world. It's divorced, it's separate. And you're going to notice that there's probably a pretty strong tension between those attributes that you say God has and the visual, the story that we get of Jesus in the New Testament. Because Jesus wasn't everywhere. Jesus did not seem to have all power. He had a lot of power. But Jesus doesn't seem to know everything. He asks people questions. He seems to want to know the answer. For that matter, Yahweh in the Old Testament does the same thing. Yahweh says, Adam, Eve, where'd you guys go? I thought we were going to hang out in the garden today. Was that a rhetorical question? Or did God really want to know?